welcome everybody to the new year and to a new class. And I'm really delighted to be able to teach this class. After watching The Crown, I thought, okay, it's a great story about British history, but we have our own crown and our own history in ancient Israel. And there are as many good stories about the crown in ancient Israel as there are in British history, for sure. So I'm kind of taking up where we left off last year. When I was teaching last year, I was talking about leadership and the development of leadership in the nation of Israel. And particularly with regard to kings, I talked about the fact that God, in fact, did not want people to have a king. God considered himself sufficient to protect the people, but the people now lived in a land and they were surrounded by their enemies and they wanted to be like everybody else and they wanted to have a king. And so God finally says, all right, fine. He tells Samuel, who was the head priest at the time, says, okay, the people want a king, they can have a king. And God selects Saul and sends Samuel to anoint him. So the royalty of Israel begins with King Saul. And today we're going to talk a little bit about King Saul, but we're mostly going to talk about two queens today. Queen Michal, who was one of David's queens, and Abigail, who was another of David's queens. So first, let's talk about the agenda for the day. We'll do a little introduction to the course. We'll talk about a little bit of the geography of ancient Israel. We'll talk about key historical dates, the genealogy of the monarchy, biblical context of monarchical narratives. That's a hard word. And that includes the Deuteronomic history and Chronicles 1 and 2. So I want to get done with Chronicles 1 and 2 really quickly because we're not going to be dealing with that in this class, but I want to explain to you that as part of the Bible, there are these two volumes at the very end called Chronicles 1 and 2. And they're generally considered to have been written in the 5th century BCE. And as I say, it was one of the last books of the Bible. It retells the story of the Israelite Jewish people, briefly summarizing the history until the reign of David, and then focusing on the reigns of David and Solomon and the kings of Judea, that is the part of Israel that remained after the 10 tribes were lost. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we move on. It largely omits anything about the Northern Kingdom, so it's Judean history. It doesn't just retell the David story, though, as it is. It has its own particular view of history, just as all of the historical books in the Bible have their own particular view. And it highlights particular events and it highlights particular concepts. And mostly it is a very pro-Samuel, pro-Kings, pro-Torah, pro-David book. But we don't really want to talk about that right now. I think we're going to move on just to the Deuteronomic history. We're going to talk about important themes in the royal narratives. And then we get to the really juicy part, the narrative of Queen Michal and the narrative of Abigail, the anti-Michal. I'm sorry that my arrow was, okay. So geography, here are maps of ancient Israel. The earlier formation of Israel was a united kingdom, and you can see that on the left. And then later on, the kingdom split. This was after Solomon's son became king, and he subjected the populace to, he did a lot of public works, which were very expensive and which required a lot of labor. And so the people got a little unhappy with him, and the Northerners set off with their own king, Jeroboam, and created their own kingdom in the north. which later on actually disappeared after the Assyrians took over, after they conquered it. Okay, significant dates, guys. The United Kingdom. And you can see here the United Kingdom included Saul's reign, David's reign when Jerusalem becomes the capital, and Solomon's reign when the first temple is built. Then in 931 BCE, secession of the Northern Kingdom. And as I say, they seceded because King Rehoboam, who was Solomon's son, was subjecting much of the populace to unwanted slavery and taxation. Nothing new, right? Okay. Then another thing we want to know about when we're going to be talking for the rest of the 4 sessions is the fact that in 874 to 853, Ahab ruled the Northern Kingdom. And Ahab is one of the most evil of kings. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. We'll talk about that next week when we talk about Ahab and Jezebel. So that's why I wanted to show you where his reign filled in. And also the death of Jezebel as a ruling as queen. And Athaliah and Ahab and Jezebel's daughter then marries Jehoram. This is a real crowny thing. She marries a Judean king. So there's a whole interplay here between, we finally have the Judean king married to somebody from the north. Then in 722, the Northern Kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, and the tribes are spread out by the Assyrians because the way the Assyrians affected their conquering was by spreading people out. So the 10 tribes were in fact really sent out to various kingdoms and various places in the Assyrian Empire, and that was the end of those people. So now we come back to, now we all we have is Judah. All we have is that lower area of the country where Jerusalem is. And in 716, Hezekiah was the king of Jerusalem, and he resisted the Assyrian attempt to capture Jerusalem. And he was successful largely because he was a good king, meaning he believed in Yahweh and he supported Yahweh, and he did whatever he could do to promote Yahweh's rules, laws, commandments. But the first temple was then destroyed during the Babylonian exile. In 620, Josiah was the Judean king, and he instituted Deuteronomic reforms, and we'll talk about those as well coming up. In 587, the Southern Kingdom was taken over by the Babylonian Empire, and that was essentially the end of a sovereign Jewish nation. In 541, though, importantly, the first Jews returned from Babylon. They returned in small numbers, and they rebuilt the city and its walls, and they started to rebuild the temple, and the 70 years of exile were terminated. And then we talk about the beginning of the building of the second temple. Here's the genealogy of the kings of Israel. As you can see, Saul was the first king. He had a son, Ishbosheth, who ruled for 2 years. And then he was killed in battle. David became the king, then Solomon. David had 3 sons, Adoniah, Absalom, and Solomon. He had more than 3 sons, but those are the relevant ones in terms of his crown. And those are the relevant ones in terms of who was fighting for his crown. And we will learn next week why Solomon got the crown. And as I said, he had a son, Rehoboam, and because of Rehoboam's actions, Jeroboam broke off, and we see on the left-hand side the rulers of Israel. And you'll see that Ahab was a ruler of Israel. And you'll see down there, let's see if I can point to it, where Ahab married Jezebel. And they had Athaliah. And it's one of the interesting stories about Jezebel being a queen mother and Athaliah, her daughter, having a lot of power. So we will get into that in a couple of weeks. And you can see on and on the kings and how on the left-hand side, the northern Israelites ended their reign much earlier than on the right-hand side, when the Judean kings were finally terminated by the Babylonians. Okay, let's talk about the context of these monarchical narratives. And I bring in here a quote that I think is very important when understanding any of these monarchical narratives, which is that history is written by the winners. A quote that's been attributed to Winston Churchill. And just like any other history, the history in our Tanakh was probably written to some extent by the winners. So the context, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel 1 and 2, and Kings 1 and 2 are referred to by scholars as the Deuteronomic history. These volumes, one, focus on the centralization of religious activity in the temple in Jerusalem rather than in local shrines. So the Deuteronomic history is linked to the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy has its own theology, and it was a theology that essentially in which God tells the people that he will determine where the people will worship. Up until that time, there had been shrines around the country, and that continued in the north. But under the Deuteronomic rules, all of the cultic activity, all of the religious activity was supposed to take place at the temple in Jerusalem. Deuteronomic history also argues vehemently against the use of any image or icon in worship. So you're worshiping God, the invisible God, and anything that has to do with idols or Asherah, which can be poles that people had set up in temples that were objects of worship, are illegitimate. And the Deuteronomic history introduces the concept that the survival of a given king and of the covenanted people, that is the people who are covenanted with Yahweh, was strictly dependent on their loyalty to Yahweh. And this is known in academics as the historical causation. Not that you're going to ever use that again, but basically, so there were three basic tenets that are included in the Deuteronomic history. And they're kind of the tenets that we're familiar with. They're the tenets that we have carried through to modern time. And so they're the tenets that were, so the history is in fact written by whoever those winners were. When was it written? When was the Deuteronomic history written? Okay, so this is a little academic, but I think it's always helpful to have the context. The theory is that the Deuteronomic history reflects and is even attributed to the religious reforms of King Josiah and the Judean king who ruled from 640 to 609. So when was the Deuteronomic history written? I told you it was written by, they think it was written in the period of King Josiah. It was probably written by priests during that period and scribes. And a second edition of the Deuteronomic history may actually have been written during the Babylonian exile to add on all the other kings that came after Josiah. It was clearly a book of the Judean populace. It wasn't, it had nothing that came from Israel. Who wrote it? Okay. We don't know, obviously, who actually, quote unquote, wrote the books of the Bible. but and oftentimes it's not one author, and probably all the time it's not one author, but it's a group of editors who came together and edited a lot of text. So but in academia, the author of this text is referred to as the Deuteronomist, or D for short. The biblical scholar Robert Alter, who writes a lot about this period, explains that Dee was not strictly a historian, but he was also a skilled narrator who included older textual materials found in the Royal Archives, including annals and folktales and legends, as well as oral materials in the work, and wrote the work according to Dee's own ideological bent. Again. However, there is probably some of the older material that was so ingrained in the mind of Dee's audience that Dee could not change it to suit his needs. So that Alter also explains that nearly a third of the Deuteronomic history is devoted to the narrative of Saul and David, found in the books of Samuel 1 and 2. Kings 1 and 2 continues the historical narrative, also with the insertions of folk memories. Alter, and he's, besides being a biblical scholar, Alter is also a literary scholar, and he loves especially the stories of Saul and David. And I love reading what he has to say because it's always very cogent. Alter explains that the story of Saul and David actually predates Dee, perhaps by as much as 3 centuries. So in the ancient world, there were stories that circulated all around, and the people were very invested in these stories, and they became then part of the written basis for people's history. Alter refers to these narratives, that is the narratives of Saul and David, as, quote, one of the greatest pieces of narrative in all Western history. Though David is clearly represented as a divinely elected king in this narrative, he is also quite strikingly, in all his human weakness, in his relentlessness and his moral ambiguity, hardly a figure of royal propaganda. So although David may be the quote unquote hero and the victor that the history was written about, there's much that is put into question about David's personality. And that's what's so fascinating to me about these histories, is that particularly in the Deuteronomic history, the humanness of the kings and the queens comes out, and it's very much a part of the story. Important themes in royal narratives, the concept of honor and shame in the ancient Near East. What we have to remember is that the Israel-Judah did not exist on its own. It was part of, as I showed you in the earlier maps, it was part of a much larger ancient Near Eastern society, where there were battles all the time between different nations. And they were a very small nation, so they were always concerned about their lives and their future. But they also absorbed the culture of the ancient Near East. And very important to the culture of the ancient Near East, and very important to the Deuteronomic history, is the concept of honor and shame. And you'll see how this plays out as we talk about the story of Michal. And I'll just note that honor and shame was the subject of my dissertation, so it's one of my favorite subjects. Another important theme in the royal narratives is the chosenness of David. Yes, David is the king that God chose, and he was the king that he was going to stick with no matter what. Saul was an experiment, and God, I think, basically realized it was an experiment that wasn't going to work, and so he then chose David. And despite all of David's peccadillos, God stuck with David. And arguably it's because David stuck with God, but we'll find many cases where David went off the deep end. The other thing, which I talked about earlier, another important theme in the royal narrative, is the centrality of monolithic Yahweh. There was one God. There were no, as I said, no idols, no images. It was the one God who was the God of the people, who gave the Torah to the people, who gave the laws to the people, and that was the prime mover in all of history in the Bible. Okay. Now we get to the fun part. We'll talk about the Michal narrative, and the first part of the Michal narrative that I want to look at is the marriage of David and Michal. Okay, so I don't know if somebody, and it has to be somebody on Zoom because the Zoom people can't hear the people. The Zoom people can't hear the people here. So would somebody on Zoom like to read the verses here? Anybody?
I'll read them
Okay.
if you want.
Rosalie?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Now Michal, daughter of Saul, had fallen in love with David, and when this was reported to Saul, he was pleased. Saul thought, I will give her to him, and she can serve as a snare for him, so that the Philistines may kill him. So Saul said to David, you can become my son-in-law, even now through the second one. And Saul instructed his courtiers to say to David privately, the king is fond of you and all his courtiers like you, so why not become the king's son-in-law? When the king's courtiers repeated these words to David, David replied, do you think that becoming the son-in-law of a king is a small matter when I am but a poor man of no consequence? And Saul said, say this to David, the king desires no other bride price than the foreskins of 100 Philistines as vengeance on the king's enemies. Saul intended to bring about David's death at the hands of the Philistines. When his courtiers told this to David, David was pleased with the idea of becoming the king's son-in-law. David went out with his men and killed 200 Philistines. David brought their foreskins and they were counted out for the king that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul then gave him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. Okay. Saul had originally promised his elder daughter to David, but then married. I can't see it because your face is in the way.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rosalie.
You're welcome.
So we have Saul, who we now know is not going to be the successful king, but was always scheming. And so he takes his daughter, Michal, and it's important. I highlighted daughter of Saul because if you've studied with me before, you know that epithets or how people are described are very, very important in the biblical text. They're clues. They're clues about what's going to happen. They're clues about who people are. They're clues about the tone. So here we know that Michal is the daughter of Saul. And Saul, we see Saul's personality being reflected in the fact that he thinks to himself, and this is wonderful. We have Saul thinking to himself in the Bible. I mean, it's not a law. It's a story, and it's a story where we have somebody's train of thought. And so it makes it very real. It makes it very real as any novel or that we might read otherwise. So we get the sense of Saul's personality. We get the sense of his feelings towards David. He wants to destroy David. And he understands that his daughter, who has fallen in love with David, might be the key, might be the ticket to actually destroying David. He really had very little interest in having David as his son-in-law. So there's this whole back and forth with the king talking to the courtiers and the courtiers talking to David. And David responds and he says, do you think I should become the son-in-law of the king? And when I'm a poor man and of no consequence? So here where something is revealed about David, because what you have to understand is that up until this point, David has become the darling of the people, of this Israelite people, because he's been busy destroying Philistines right and left. So it's a sense of false modesty that is revealed here. In very few verses, we learn so much about all of these different characters. David it really reveals a lot about him that he's so falsely modest. Okay, so David accomplishes what he needs to accomplish, and Michal becomes his wife. Like most royal marriages, the marriage of David and Michal was a strategic one. David was more successful than Saul in all of his military campaigns, and he was adored by the people. Saul dreaded him because he thought that God favored David instead of him. The one thing that we have in these texts is the imposition of God, which is not necessarily we have in other histories, but in our Deuteronomic history, God is always involved and God is always moving the pieces. So when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that Michal, daughter of Saul, loved him, Saul grew still more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy ever after. So this is following what we've just discussed, and the important thing here is that even though she's characterized as the daughter of Saul, she loves David, which makes a big problem for Saul. Notably, and very importantly, the narrative is the only place in the Hebrew Bible which describes a woman being in love with a man. But there's no indication that that love is reciprocated. Would somebody else like to read this second part of the second excerpt from this whole history, which is David's escape? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can
Oh,
you-
hi, Harry. Yes, I can. Please. Thank you. Wonderful.
I'll read. And Saul sent messengers to David's house to keep watch on him and to put him to death in the morning. But David's wife, Michal, told him, unless you run for your life tonight, you will be killed tomorrow. Michal let David down from the window and he escaped and fled. Michal then took the household idol, laid it on the bed, and covered it with a cloth, and at its head she put a net of goat's hair. Saul sent messengers to seize David, but she said he is sick. Saul, however, sent back the messengers to see David for themselves. Bring him up to me in the bed, he ordered, that he may be put to death. When the messengers came, they found the household idol in the bed with the net of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, why did you play that trick on me and let my enemy get away safely? Because, Michal answered Saul, he said to me, help me to get away or I'll kill you.
Okay, so here Saul thought he was going to be able to get rid of David, when in fact that truly wasn't what's going to happen. And again, when we talk about epithets here, what I highlighted is that at this point in the story, Michal is no longer characterized as Saul's daughter, but in fact, she's now characterized as David's wife, and so we know what side she's on. And she's what we learn about her personality here is that she's very clever. And what we probably also can derive about her personality is that she was not very fond of her father, who had basically imposed her on this other man. Even though she loved him, her father was using her as the chess piece.
Annette, excuse me, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why did she lie? Saul knows she loves David, So why doesn't she just say, because I love him, I don't want him to be killed? Because Saul knew that she loved him, she had told him. So why would she bother lying and saying he threatened to kill me, which makes him look even worse in Saul's eyes than before? That doesn't make sense to me.
Can somebody,
So why did Michal tell her father that David would kill her if she didn't?
because she's making up a story.
Why?
He wants to know why she's lying.
Why is she lying?
Saul knows.
Oh, why is she lying?
She said that
Yeah.
Saul knows that she loves David, so why didn't she say, I didn't want you to kill him because I love him? That's what Sandy.
Because she doesn't want to, in my opinion, it's just a way of her getting out of her, of being very guilty for helping him escape. So she can't just say she loves him because she's now committed a capital crime, essentially. She's helped the king's enemy get away. So she has to say something that will justify what she did, and loving David would not be in the Saul eyes, those people who followed Saul, the Saul's eyes, that wouldn't be a very good excuse. Andy, okay? Yeah.
What's this business about a household idol? What they were supposed to be one God and all that. Maybe.
The household idol.
Oh, the household items. Okay, very good question. There are many stories about household idols, particularly with relationship to women. And the archaeology and much of what we know about this period is only through archaeology and through the stories. There's no absolute proof of David. There's no absolute proof of Saul. There's no, other than this history, there's no other history written about them, no contemporaneous history. And particularly with respect to women in archaeology, they have found many, many figurines. And they theorize that these figurines were fertility talisman, and there were household idols. It goes against the concept of God being the sole monolithic God, but you'll see. As I said, okay, so there were many stories that were interpolated, many ancient stories that were interpolated into these histories. And this is probably one of those ancient stories. Now, we know another story about a biblical female hero who also hid idols.
That was Rachel.
From, what?
He said that was Rachel.
Rachel, she hid the teraphim when she was leaving Laban.
Also, she also that was before her father.
Right. And her father was kind of a tricky, wicked guy, and she got the tricky part from him. And similarly, Michal got the tricky part from Saul. So it's consistent. I tried to find some article that explained more clearly why there was this analogy, why we could find this very clear analogy between Michal and Rachel. And I just couldn't find anything that actually spoke to it, but it's very clear and it's very noticeable. So did I answer your question? Anybody else? And the problem for those of us who read Bible is these, because it's a patriarchal book, we don't know about whether the men had any idols talismans that they carried with them, but we do know that usually women are associated with talismans, usually women are associated with Asherah, usually women, queens and women are associated with Canaanite gods and goddesses. That's one thing that's an unfortunate part, in my opinion, an unfortunate part of our text. So to return, after David flees Saul's court, he has 2 secret meetings with Saul's son, Jonathan, who's his friend and also an aide to him in escaping from Saul. So it wasn't just Michal, Saul's daughter, but it was Jonathan, Saul's son. And we'll, in a couple of weeks, we'll look at a couple of the stories about Saul and Jonathan because it's a very unpleasant relationship. But David does not attempt to provide for Michal or to take her with him. But he does arrange for his parents' safety. And he has other wives with him in the wilderness and in the land of the Philistines. So there is absolutely no evidence that Michal's love for David was given back by David to Michal. There's just no evidence of it at all. In fact, it's probably the contrary. So we talked a little bit about what aspects of Michal's personality are revealed in this episode. She's smart. She is a royal daughter. She is willing to go against her father. She's clever. And what do we learn about David's personality? As we said, we learned that he could be falsely modest. We learned that even though someone would love him, he did not feel that he necessarily had to reciprocate that love, but he used people. He used whoever he could in order to succeed. And we also just talked about the story of Rachel.
Her father, it seems like her father did the same thing for Michal. She was used by her father.
Right.
I'll use her to ensnare him, David. And then David also uses her. She's active, she's a very active character, but she's terribly used by the men.
Okay, so what was just said here is that, and it's important, she's used. She is a woman who was used not only by her father, but by her husband. And so one might think that in fact, she was totally embittered.
David
Okay,
had
so
marrying her. He didn't love her. He only married her for political reasons. And to me, that's reprehensible. I think it's terrible what he did to her. And later, he treats her like really terribly. I really always felt very sorry for her.
yeah. Yep, absolutely.
Married her. That was a rotten thing for him to do because he only married her to get power.
That's right. Okay, so after escaping from Saul, David becomes an outlaw and he has an entourage and basically a gang of guys, and they're living in the wilderness. And there's much that's written that say that basically they were a real gang, and they may have even had a protection racket going on, protecting shepherds from enemies and from those who were out to harm them. And while he's in the wilderness, he also takes 2 other wives, Abigail and Ahinoam. And in the meantime, our friend Saul then marries Michal off yet again. The legality of that and whether that was actually legal under Jewish law or Israelite law at that time is questionable, but Saul would do anything to defeat his archenemy. So Saul had given his daughter Michal, here now characterized as David's wife. It's Saul's daughter and David's wife, and he gave her to Palti, son of Laish from Gabim. And then shortly thereafter, he actually then deprives her of her loving husband. And how do we know he was a loving husband? And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, sent and took her from her husband Paltiel. But her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner, who was the commander of chiefs of Saul's army, said to him, "Go return," and he returned. So again, Saul manipulates this poor young woman and takes her away from somebody who obviously had feelings for her. And I find it interesting that we know nothing in this situation about how Michal felt about Paltiel, which is, it's such an ironic twist to the fact that David clearly was not reciprocating Michal's love, and we have now Michal has turned into this kind of blank slate, and we don't know whether this was something that was painful to her, but it was certainly had to be painful in the sense that she was being thrown thither and yon from man to man, and really had no place to be.
That was so disrespectful of her father to do that.
What was her,
Disrespectful. It was, yes, it was disrespectful. Clearly it was disrespectful. It was abusive. Yes. She was in at least 2 abusive relationships, and it makes us wonder, here now she had a man who really loved her. How would she have reacted to him? And we kind of leaves us with an open question.
I was like, I love the name of Saul's son, Ish-Bosheth. I don't know about it. Talk about, how important the name is. Ish-Bosheth means the man who is ashamed. The man of shame, the man of shame.
Okay, so the rabbi's pointing out that Ish-Bosheth, which is the name of Saul's son, means a man who was ashamed. And yes, there was shame. And again, when we talk about shame and honor, there is no honor in these stories. It's all about shaming other people. It's all about shaming. And that is a terrible thing in the ancient Near East, to be shamed. Okay, so like the tale of David's escape, the final chapter of the Michal narrative also involves a window. After being separated from Paltiel, Michal can be found peering through the window of the palace, where she's now been returned to, and so obviously she is now being returned to her the role of queen, David's wife. And the context for this story is David's triumphant return to Jerusalem with the precious ark of Yahweh, which had been held hostage by the Philistines. And there's a whole ark narrative and the return of the ark narrative. And this was a tremendous success on David's part to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. Does anybody want to read? Can I get anybody at home to read? Susie, sister-in-law Susie? Anybody?
Yeah, I'll read. All right. So at 14.
Thank you.
Okay. And David was whirling with all his might before the Lord, girt with the linen ephod, and David
Ephod.
and the whole ephod.
It was then. And ephod is the apron that the priests wore.
Okay. And David and the whole house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord in shouts and with the sound of the ram's horn. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out through the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she scorned him in her heart. I don't blame her. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it up in its place within the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered up burnt offerings before the Lord and the well-being sacrifices. And David finished offering up the burnt offerings and the well-being sacrifices, and he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he shared out to all the multitude of Israel, every man and woman, 1 loaf of bread and 1 date cake and 1 raisin cake. And every one of the people went to his home. And David turned back to bless his house. And Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. And she said, "How honored is the king of Israel, who has exposed himself today to the eyes of his servants' slaves girls, as some scurrilous fellow would expose himself." And David said to Michal, before the Lord who chose me instead of your father, and instead of all his house to appoint me prince over the Lord's people, over Israel, I will play before the Lord. And I will be dishonored still more than this, and will be debased in my own eyes. But with the slave girls about whom you spoke, with them let me be honored. And Michal had no child till her dying day. That is so sad.
Why is she being punished?
It is that. And thank you, Susie.
Yeah.
Okay, so we see from the epithets here that Michal never escaped the fact that she was the daughter of Saul. So even though she's in the palace, even though she is a queen in the palace looking down on her triumphant husband, she is characterized as Saul's daughter. And this is a very important sentence. And she scorned him in her heart. She despised him. She truly despised him. She had no sense of honor left for him. She only felt shamed by him, and she only saw him behaving shamefully. I mean, it's thought that he was whirling in such a fever that his clothes were swirling around him, and his nudity was uncovered, and so that's why she says this, and she says she's most concerned about the fact that he's carrying on in front of the general populace. He is endearing himself to the general populace. He's not acting in a royal fashion the way her father might have, but he knows how to play everybody. He is playing the people, or if you don't want to use a negative term, he is trying to whip the people up into a fervent state of worshiping the art and God, but also obviously of recognizing his role as the hero. The other thing that's interesting about this particular text is that at one point in Saul's history, he tried to perform sacrifices for God. And that is usually a role that is left for the priests. And Samuel basically told Saul that God was very angry with him for performing sacrifices because Samuel was supposed to perform the sacrifices. Well, there's no problem here with David performing sacrifices. So it's very clear that David was able to at least had that much of God's favor that he was able to do something. But you can imagine that Michal, knowing that her father was punished for performing the sacrifices, would have even detested David even more. And the language is a little bit different, but it is a little bit difficult. But basically, David is saying, I will make a fool of myself if that's what it takes to get the populace to worship Yahweh.
Are we supposed to surmise that she didn't have children because she scorned David? Is there supposed to be a connection there? That just like that tag on sentence.
Okay. Okay. So the question is, did she not have children because she scorned David? We're going to get to that right now. Okay. What does this episode tell us about her personality? We talked about that a little bit. Is the confrontation a consequence of sexual jealousy, royal arrogance on her part, her lack of religious enthusiasm? And what is the significance of her childlessness? Because that is very important. In her analysis of the final Michal episode, the biblical scholar Cheryl Exum, who writes a lot about women in the Bible, says that Michal had to be eliminated for the threat of contamination that she represents. Her childless state is not just a sign of the breakdown of a marriage bond, because it could be that David basically, when she insulted him in public, basically said, that's it, lady, I'm not sleeping with you again. Or is it that God basically took away any ability for her to have children? But what Exum is saying is that There will be no child of this union, no descendant of Saul, who was also a descendant of David, right? And who, as scion of both royal houses, might claim the throne in the name of the houses rejected by God. So there's political implications of her having children and so not having children. There's sexual implications. There's personality implications. It's a very powerful sentence. And most of these sentences are short, brief sentences that tell us so much. And that's what's so fascinating about the whole book and the whole text. Why is David the hero? Well, David is the hero because he understands the significance of honoring Yahweh and exciting the populace to follow him, including what may have been considered the lowest rung of society, his servant slave girls. He has abased himself for the greater glory of Yahweh.
I have a
Now,
problem with that.
what, Sandy?
I have a problem with that. I don't think that's honoring God to expose yourself, to expose your bodies twirling around like a maniac. That's just, and the arrogant way he spoke to-
Hi, it's me again. I just don't know how to get the sound on here.
Okay, so you
I can
see
hear
on the
you.
bottom, the little bottom right.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
looks like a speaker.
Anyway, I think
No, I
that
don't see it.
the arrogant way he spoke
If
to
I saw it, I would know.
God chose me, not your father. I mean, that doesn't sound like a very not kind person. It sounds like a very arrogant, egotistical person. And to expose yourself like that in front of the population, I don't think that's honoring God. I think that's shaming yourself. I don't see that as honoring God at all. And frankly, from what you said about the victors writing history, which I definitely agree with, maybe David didn't really write the Psalms. I don't think that anyone who is that has that kind of.
Dan is
Yeah,
just telling
oh,
me
I
what
see.
Sandy said, and I agree with her.
Yeah.
Well, can I never get that?
This kind of action shows some kind of response.
Right, David wrote the songs.
David,
Doesn't believe- David,
uh,
yeah, how could he have written the songs?
well, that's a whole nother story. Whether David wrote the Psalms or not is a whole nother story. We'll have to save that for another class.
I'm gonna pull an audible here, guys. All
All
right.
right.
This has been really fun, and I really want to get into Abigail, the anti-Mafal. But this is getting, I think, probably very tedious for everybody out there. So I kind of need a vote as to whether I have about 3 more slides. And you know what? I'll do the reading and then we'll just finish it up.
Go for it.
Huh?
Go for it.
Okay.
Go for
So
it.
David escaped Saul and when David had escaped Saul, he fled into the wilderness. And I told you he had this entourage of outlaws. And
I got it. This is the key. Is to move this one. No, let's move this one. You're good. There. Good. You're good.
Okay, hi, guys. So David and his outlaws come into the land of this fellow named Nabal, a rich sheep farmer with a beautiful wife named Abigail. And I want to point out one thing we never hear about Nahal, never, is that she was beautiful. We never hear anything about the physical attributes of Nahal. Anyway, the man's name was Nabal and his wife's name was Abigail. The woman was intelligent. This is what it says in the Bible. She was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, which is from the people that lived in the tribe of Benjamin, was a hard man and an evildoer. So Nabal, when he meets David, denies even knowing who David is and subsumes a superior attitude that is reminiscent of what we just talked about with Michal. And Michal speaks to David's servants, and he says, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many slaves nowadays who run away from their masters. And David said to his men, gird your swords. Each girded his sword. And David too girded his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, and they were going to go get Nabal. But this very clever Abigail, Nabal's wife, recognizes the potential consequences of her husband's rude behavior and seeks out David with gifts of wine and bread to prevent him from killing her husband, not for Nabal's sake, but for David's. Please, my lord, she says, please pay no attention to the wretched fellow Nabal, for he is just what his name says. His name means boar, and he is a boar. I swear, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as you live, the Lord, who has kept you from seeking redress by blood with his own hands, let your enemies and all who would harm you, my lord, fare like Nabal. Here is the present which your maidservant has brought to my lord. Let it be given to the young men who are the followers of my lord. And she brings him, as I said, feed and wine. And then she says, please pardon your maid's boldness. Everybody knew who everybody was in the situation. Nabal certainly knew who David was because David was a hero, a national hero. Abigail, we know, is this intelligent, beautiful woman. And she, of course, is in perfect ancient Near Eastern style, being totally deferential to David. And she bows down to him. She forgives him for being bold. She asks him to forgive her for being bold. And she said, she acknowledges how important he is to God. And she says, and if anyone sets out to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord will be bound up in a bundle of his life in the care of the Lord, but he will fling away the lives of your enemies as from the hollow of a sling. So obviously she knew the story about David and Goliath. So she's playing to him in every possible way that a woman could play to a man. And when the Lord has accomplished for my Lord, the Lord God has accomplished for my Lord all the good he has promised you and has appointed you ruler of Israel. Do not let this be the cause of stumbling, this meaning her husband's rudeness, and don't go shed his blood, don't kill him, because that'll just take away from your honor. So David says to Abigail, praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed be your prudence, and blessed be you yourself for restraining me from seeking redress in blood from my own hands. So there's this great mutual admiration society. She praises him, he praises her, and then surprise, surprise, Nabal dies suddenly, apparently from a stroke. And when David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel and told her that David had sent them to make her his wife, she immediately bowed down low with her face to the ground and said, your handmaiden is ready to be your maidservant to wash the feet of my Lord's servant. So she knows what's up. She is deferential. And interestingly, to wash the feet of the servants reminds us a little bit about what Michal says about David. You're just playing to the servants, but she knows that that's what he wants. That's exactly what he wants. And we have no idea whether she really had a religious feeling for God, but she knows that that's the talk. She talks the talk. And then Abigail rose quickly and mounted an ass with 5 of her maids in attendance. She followed David's messengers and she became his wife. There's no mourning period mentioned. There's nothing like that. She goes from the husband that she despises to knowing that she will be marrying the future king of Israel. So Abigail and Michal in contrast. In a sharp contrast with the brevity of Michal's address to David when she tells him how awful he is, Abigail is surpassed only by Rachel and the number of speaking lines attributed to her in Tanakh. So she is, in other words, Abigail has more speech in the Tanakh than any other woman except Rachel. Unlike Michal, who was portrayed as an embittered victim of both her father and her husband, and she was, Abigail is depicted as a master manipulator with superior wisdom and rhetorical skills who responds to David by acknowledging his honor and superiority. And as I said, there is no physical description of Michal, but Abigail is not only intelligent, but she's also beautiful. While Michal is childless, Abigail does give birth to David's second son, Chileab. However, he is never a contender for the throne and is mentioned actually only twice in the Tanakh. The problem may have been here, the same that could have been the problem, sort of the same, could have been the problem with Michal, in the sense that, well, not quite. The problem would have been that if she had gotten pregnant, and if she gotten pregnant right away, which obviously she must have, people might think that it was Nabal's child and not David's. And so this would have been not acceptable. And so she does have a child. And so she, to not have a child in ancient Near East is the greatest dishonor that a woman can have. So we can't dishonor her the way we can dishonor Michal, because Michal is dishonoring the king. She honors the king. She does have a child, but that child basically becomes irrelevant. Abigail is also listed in the Talmud as one of the 7 Jewish women prophets. The others being Miriam, Deborah. She is in great company. Hannah, Sarah, Huldah, and Esther. Okay, so I think what I love about these tales is that they are tales about people. They're tales about people who know how to talk to other people, who know how to manipulate other people. And they're real tales. They're tales about our lives. They're tales about people we know, but they're our history.
Who was the first son?
I think that's amazing.
It says Shilei is the second son. Who was the first son, and who was the mother of the first son?
The mother of
Just
David.
read, said it was the second.
Was the mother of David's first son?
Yeah.
I don't know. I got to check. And do you know, Barbara? I think you're right. I think it's Ahinoam, but maybe Marav. Yeah.
Let me circulate something for people who are upset about Michal and just want fiction. In case you didn't read it, Geraldine Brooks' book, The Secret Chord. It's filled in all these stories in a very interesting way, and there's a lot in there about Michal and politics.
Okay,
So that's total modern fiction, but I think it's great reading Geraldine Brooks.
also, so Barbara is suggesting a book by Geraldine Brooks called
The Secret Chord. Secret Chord. Chord. C-H-O-R-D.
Chord.
the
Secret Chord.
The Secret Chord, which has stories about Michal, and I have not read it, but I will now. So thank you. Next week we're going to, first of all, I want to thank people for your patience. I know this wasn't easy. I'm not sure whether maybe we'll just end up doing this all on Zoom because of I love having people here, and but you people on Zoom can't hear the people here. We'll have to do a little post-game review. If anybody wants to send me an email and make a recommendation as to what we should do, I'm all for it. So next week, we're going to talk about one more of David's wives, Bathsheba, and we'll also talk about a very interesting couple, Ahab and Jezebel. So I look forward to that. It's more juicy stuff. David and Bathsheba is particularly juicy from the perspective, not just of sex, but from the way the language draws out these people and their personalities. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but it's been great having you. Have a good night.